We flip a switch, and the world just bends to our will. That's the unspoken contract of modern life, isn't it?
It really is. But we rarely think about how deep that dependence goes.
It's everything.
It's profound. Electricity isn't just power for your phone or, your lights. It is the fundamental resource that fuels everything else.
Water waste management.
Food preservation, transport, communication systems. I mean, try to genuinely imagine modern social life without constant power. It's functionally impossible.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, we are looking at what happens when that contract breaks. We are scrutinizing the causes and consequences of power cuts, of blackouts.
And the key takeaway from the sources is, frankly, alarming. These power systems, this critical infrastructure, it's actually more fragile than we all suppose.
More fragile and getting worse.
Undeniably. It's getting frailer. Our mission here is to treat every blackout, from a regional inconvenience to a total collapse, as a dress rehearsal for what might be coming.
That immediately raises the stakes. So we're examining the accelerating risks, from aging parts to, solar storms?
Yes, and then the cascading social and economic effects.
And finally, we'll tackle the surprisingly profound, almost philosophical challenge of how do you actually rebuild civilization after a catastrophic, long-term power loss?
Let's unpack this.
Right.
So why is the grid getting frailer now specifically? It seems like we're at a perfect pressure point.
That's a good way to put it. It's growing uncertainties in supply matched by this almost reckless certainty in demand. The core conflict right there.
Exactly. On the supply side, the problem, it largely boils down to infrastructural neglect.
Especially in the U.S. and Europe.
Right. We are talking about decades of poor investment. I mean, the numbers are they're shocking. Almost 3/4 of U.S. transmission lines and power transformers are already over 25 years old.
25 years.
Yeah.
And the power plants themselves.
The average age of a power plant in the U.S. is now 30 years.
That's like running a high-performance computer network on equipment from the 1990s. It just seems completely unsustainable.
And it's not just age. The sources show it's a failure to innovate. We've seen deregulation lead electric utilities to collectively slash R&D spending by a staggering 78.6%.
78%.
Yeah.
So where is the innovation that's supposed to adapt to modern energy needs?
Yeah.
Where does it come from?
It's simply not happening fast enough. And you combine that decay with resource constraints, like our dependence on fossil fuels and the vagaries of climate change affecting renewables.
And you see why regulators are constantly raising red flags.
Constantly. They signaled security concerns in the UK, for example, that the grid stability could be seriously reduced by certain winter conditions.
And all this is happening while the demand side just keeps growing relentlessly.
Driven by population, affluence, and what the sources call consumer addictions.
The addiction analogy is strong. What are the main drivers there?
The sources highlight two massive ones. The first is air conditioning.
We all love our AC, but what's the actual scale of that consumption?
Get this. Air conditioning accounts for 20% of U.S. domestic electricity consumption.
20%.
That figure alone, just for cooling, is equivalent to the entire electrical demand of the African continent.
That is an unbelievable statistic.
And it's set to grow. Commercial cooling is expected to grow another 22% over the next 2 decades. It's this non-negotiable comfort that is just overloading the system.
Okay, so that's driver number one. What's the second?
Electric vehicles, EVs.
Which are environmentally necessary, but are the sources arguing this just pushes the risk from fossil fuels over to the electric grid?
Absolutely. It pushes the strain onto the weakest link. Converting the personal vehicle fleet in a high-income area could increase electricity demand by 15 to 40%.
What about smart charging? Charging overnight when demand is low?
Even with that, the modeling is grim. If all household vehicles were replaced by efficient EVs, they would consume approximately twice as much electricity as all residential and commercial air conditioning combined.
So we're loading the weakest, oldest link in our infrastructure with the heaviest, most rapidly growing demands.
That's the perfect storm. And when the lights go out, we have to grasp that the failure is not isolated, it's a cascade.
It's not just that the light bulb is off.
No. It triggers this domino effect because all modern systems are profoundly interdependent. We're talking transportation, finance, water, food, communication, all affected simultaneously.
And that cascade starts almost immediately with communication. Your first instinct is to grab your cell phone.
Of course. But how long does that window last? Not long.
Few hours.
4 to 8 hours for the cell tower batteries.
Mhm.
Backup generators might stretch it to 24, maybe 48 hours, but only for the most critical facilities. And
The
crucially,
network is jammed anyway.
instantly congested. You just get that message. All circuits are busy. You are essentially isolated within hours.
Then comes the water crisis, which is a huge public health hazard.
Because pumping, cleaning, and pressurizing water is incredibly power intensive.
So the pumps fail. What's the backup?
Elevated storage tanks. They act like a battery, but the supply is finite. The sources cite the Texas requirement, for instance. Large cities need enough storage for roughly 2 days of normal use.
2 days. After 48 hours, the taps run dry.
And then the dirty water becomes the next crisis. Sewage systems fail very quickly without power.
Because the treatment plants and lift stations can't run.
Exactly. So you risk massive overflows, immediate public health emergencies. We rely on that constant movement and treatment of waste.
Looking at the economic and social costs, the numbers must stack up alarmingly fast.
The financial damage is staggering. U.S. economic losses from outages are estimated between $25 billion and $180 billion annually. It's a huge range.
That even a single failure can be catastrophic for a business.
Oh, yes. We saw one major UK bank lose its power supply for an extended period. The cost was in the hundreds of millions.
And on a more personal level, the loss of refrigeration leads to, well, human tragedy.
Immediately. Food spoilage. You have examples from milk curdling in China to a tragic spike in deaths from food poisoning in Pakistan during a 2010 heat wave blackout.
And as society darkens, crime follows.
We've seen it worldwide. Increased robbery in South Africa during their blackouts, even brazen theft of copper electricity cables in Zanzibar.
It seems like in the darkness, people turn inward. They stop relying on public utilities, which brings us to what the sources call the generator paradox.
This paradox is a perfect microcosm of the problem. A diesel generator, it solves a private problem. It gives you power, but it creates several collective ones.
Right, is air pollution.
And community envy, which can be dangerous. In places like Beirut, where generator use is massive, sources show it increased daily carcinogen exposure for residents by about 60%. And that burden, it falls disproportionately on poorer, denser areas. So now we need to shift our focus. We move from these frequent localized blackouts, the rehearsals, to the high-impact, low-probability catastrophic events.
The ones that change everything.
Right. The sources identify 3 primary pathways for a global grid failure: a severe cyber attack, a solar storm or EMP, and a systemic equipment collapse.
Let's look up first the threat from space weather. I hear a lot of acronyms here. CMEGIC. Can you clarify those for us?
Of course. A severe solar storm, something like the famous 1859 Carrington event, is estimated to be a once-in-500 years event. This involves a coronal mass ejection, or CME,
Which is?
essentially a massive blast of magnetic solar plasma racing toward Earth. When that plasma hits our planet's magnetic field, it induces geomagnetically induced currents, GICs.
So how do these invisible currents actually damage our equipment on the ground?
You can think of GICs as an invisible magnetic sledgehammer. They travel through the Earth and surge into long-distance transmission lines, but they are direct current DC, and our transformers are designed for alternating current ACs.
And that mismatch.
Can literally overload, melt, and burn out those huge transmission transformers, and those are incredibly expensive and take a very long time to replace.
And the sources say our vulnerability to another Carrington event is inconclusive.
It is. While some countries have hardened their grids, modern systems have new vulnerabilities. For instance, smart grids rely heavily on GPS for timing.
So if a solar storm takes out the satellites,
That reliance on GPS could lead to a widespread synchronization failure, collapsing the grid even if the transformers themselves survived. Though, it should be noted, some countries do use atomic clocks as a backup.
okay, now for the deliberate threats. Let's talk about the scenario model for a cyber attack, the Erebos Trojan.
This scenario models a very sophisticated malware attack on the U.S. Northeast. The malware forces generators to overload and burn out, causing a cascading outage similar to the big 2003 failure.
And the cost. The sources cite a figure that could exceed $1 trillion over 5 years. That's an abstract number for most people.
To put $1 trillion in context, that's roughly the size of the entire GDP of a major country like Mexico. But the key takeaway here isn't the direct damage to the generators.
It's the ripple effect.
It's the indirect losses. The model shows the primary costs come from the massive supply chain disruption, the inability to move goods, the collapse of finance. Those indirect costs are of a much, much larger magnitude.
And how does that compare to a physical event, like a high-altitude electromagnetic pulse, a HEMPEFI?
The consequences model very differently. A cyber attack, while devastating, might be repairable quickly enough to allow for, say, equitable kid distribution. But a year-long recovery from a hemp event, modeling found that scenario could precipitate widespread famine in the U.S.
Simply because you can't move or preserve food for that long.
For that long, over that wide an area, exactly.
Finally, we have to touch on nuclear power. What happens when a nuclear plant loses all power?
That's the nightmare scenario. It's known as a station blackout, or SBO. It's the total loss of off-site power and, at the same time, the failure of on-site emergency systems.
Which is what happened at Fukushima.
It's a dominant contributor to core damage frequency. Plants are required to be able to cope for a specified time, usually 4 to 16 hours, on batteries and other sources. Extending that coping time is one of the most effective safety measures you can take. If a catastrophic long-term failure were to happen, we run headlong into what the sources call the transitional generation.
A fascinating concept. This is the group of people who mature before a collapse but live the rest of their lives after it.
Yes. And the sources argue that this generation suffers disparately, inequitably, compared to those born into the new world.
Why is the trauma so much worse for them? It's not just that they miss their smartphones, right?
It's existential.
No.
The trauma isn't about lacking conveniences. It's the complete loss of purpose. It's this huge mismatch between their pre-collapse agency, desires, and aims, and their radically simplified post-collapse reality.
So someone who trained for 20 years to be a financial analyst or a software engineer.
Right. Their entire context, their status, their skills, all of it is rendered completely meaningless. That psychological shift, that frustration, it causes a suffering far greater than for the generation who knows nothing else.
The knowledge gap isn't just about technical skills then. It's about the erosion of all acquired social value.
Exactly. And that brings us to the rebuilding challenge. You have books like The Knowledge, How to Rebuild Our World from Scratch. They're great outlines.
But they're not a detailed instruction manual.
Not at all. The true difficulty is articulated in the sources with a simple phrase. You haven't the tools to make the tools to make the tools. You can't just jump to making a microprocessor.
You have to start with the absolute foundations, the most basic chemistry.
Precisely. Reestablishing civilization means reacquiring knowledge step by step. For instance, before you can do complex chemistry, you need to know how to make caustic potash lye from wood ash, just to make soap.
And soap is fundamental for public health.
It's the necessary foundation for the next level of technology. So ultimately, resilience boils down to the community and the individual being prepared for this stripped-down reality.
FEMA and other preppers talk about this.
Yes. They emphasize that in a catastrophic failure, you have to rely on the 5 pillars of survival: water, food, heat, communication, and mobility. If the grid fails for weeks or months, that immediate local resilience is the only thing standing between order and widespread famine.
So the major insight from this deep dive is, well, it's unavoidable. Our growing dependence on electricity makes our advanced society fundamentally vulnerable.
Deeply vulnerable.
We've looked at the severe reality of blackouts from, local crime spikes and spoiled food, all the way up to the theoretical threat of widespread famine after something like a HEMPE event.
And this inherent vulnerability of the grid, it forces us to confront our collective priorities. As blackouts increase, individuals and societies will have to balance what is wanted and what is needed.
That balance between the individual good and the collective good.
Right. We have to consciously weigh what's good for the individual, like that massive air conditioning load, with what is ultimately good for the collective and for the environment.
Which leaves us with this provocative thought for you to consider. A global grid failure, as terrifying as that sounds, could paradoxically accelerate renewable adoption. If nations are forced to rebuild their power systems from scratch, it might compel them to use distributed systems like microgrids instead of the fragile, centralized networks we rely on now. So if the light goes out completely, would the collapse of the current infrastructure be the necessary precursor to a more resilient, sustainable form of power generation?